When you decide to go offshore, I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. And it's really just from your financial planner's perspective, once you have decided that you want some offshore exposure, how do you go about doing that and implementing that in your financial plan? As I'm sure you are all very familiar, being our clients, we ask a lot of questions. So before we start, we want to understand this investment, who is going to own this investment, who's going to benefit from this investment. What is going to be the purpose of this investment? Is this because it needs to provide you with ongoing income, or have you built up a nest egg that you want to leave to your dependents as a legacy one day? When will you need to access this investment? So when we structure these products, we really do need to understand, is this something that you're going to need to access within the next 2 years, 5 years, 20 years? Because this gives us an idea of the structure that would put you in. Will you be able to access this investment when you're expecting to? Where do you want to be invested? I think we're covering that today, but typically, what are the assets you want to be invested in, and would you like to be invested locally or globally? But most importantly, why this investment? What does it mean to you? Is this the freedom once you have worked and you're now ready to retire and enjoy your life? Is this the legacy that you leave your children or your grandchildren to provide them with freedom one day? Maybe they get to study abroad. So when we talk about offshore, I just want to cover two concepts, because the products that we talk about, we can either do what we call direct offshore investing or indirect offshore investing. When we think about direct offshore investing, I want you to think about you're physically going to take your rand and you're going to convert it into another currency. It's going to leave South Africa. So you're going to hold hard currency in dollars or in Great British pounds. And how you do this is you would use your single discretionary allowance or your foreign offshore allowance. So you are allowed to use R1 million a year to take offshore between January and December without having to go through the tax clearance process. Just remember that included in this R1 million allowance would be spending on Netflix or traveling abroad. So you need to take that into account when you're saying that the funds you're moving over is going to capture that 1 million. The next 10 million you can take abroad through your foreign discretionary allowance. And this is a tax clearance process that you need to undertake through SARS, and it can be quite a lengthy and detailed process, but this allows you to take whatever you've applied for up to 12 months. So it's not necessarily in a calendar year. This type of investing is suitable for investors who want their funds physically held abroad. So maybe you need to access your funds abroad, you plan on immigrating, or perhaps your children are living abroad and you know that they're going to inherit this, or you just want the comfort or safety of knowing that your funds have physically been externalized. The other way of getting offshore exposure is what we would call the indirect option. So this is where you have a rand-based investment, and it is a much simpler process as you're not needing to externalize your funds. So what happens is you'd have a local platform that will facilitate the ability to get offshore exposure using the asset swap basis. So they would use their allowance in order to purchase offshore shares. You're not having to go and externalize money. You're not having to go through the onerous process of exchanging funds, and you're not having to worry about currency fluctuations. What's important here is that you remain invested in rand. So when you invest, it is in rand, and when you disinvest, it is in rand as well. Certain products only have the option for indirect offshore exposure, but what's great about this is that it doesn't limit you to only having local assets in your investment if it is a locally domiciled investment. So just something like a retirement annuity fund, you are able to get offshore exposure within certain regulatory limits. When it comes to the different types of investments, so I thought we would just kind of summarize the typical types of investments that you as our investors would have, and we'll go through them in more detail. But as you can see, Your retirement, your living annuity, and your tax-free investments, these are all investments where we're only able to obtain offshore exposure through the indirect method. Some of them, being your retirement funds, are limited in terms of how much offshore exposure you can get. So when you're wanting to ensure, or when we're looking to build a portfolio that includes offshore exposure for the right in the right balance for you, we would look not just at going directly offshore, but what investments do you hold here, and how do we then optimize those investments? Living annuities and tax-free investments, you are not limited in terms of how much you can take offshore. And then with your unit trust, your endowments and cash, you can decide whether you want to use the direct method or indirect method. Also, I just want to briefly run through, when we look at these structures, it's important for us to understand what are the liquidity requirements or the liquidity rules around these. So when I asked earlier, when do you want to access these funds? Why is that important for us to understand? Because there's different ways in which these funds allow you to have access. Some of them are restricted, like for example, a living annuity. You can't just take everything out. You are limited in terms of how you can pull that money out. Whereas a unit trust, for example, if you needed a large capital lump sum, you can take it out. Then from a tax and estate planning perspective, again, just important for us to understand who is going to benefit from these one day, as they all have different structures. And none of us at the end of the day want to pay more tax than what we need to. So we look to reduce the tax burden as well as the estate tax burden on the structuring of your investments when we build these portfolios.
Okay, so I know what you're all thinking now. How do I get offshore exposure? In the first 3 products that Erin mentioned, I'm going to speak through indirect offshore exposure. So you might have exposure in your investments to offshore and might not even know it. So in a retirement fund, you would have indirect offshore exposure to these assets. There is limitations on how much offshore exposure you can have, and I'm going to go through that in a second. But there also is restrictions on accessibility when it comes to retirement funds. So you need to understand when you can access them, and when you put money in, you can't access it before you're age 55. While retirement funds might seem scary and you might not want to lock your money away, we know that these are the most tax-efficient vehicles to save for your retirement, as these contributions are tax deductible. A retirement fund also doesn't form part of your estate. So this asset sits outside of your estate and it's distributed to your financial dependents, which is decided on by the trustees of the fund. So no executors' fees will be charged on these investments, as well as no estate duty. So if we just take a deeper dive into Regulation 28, Regulation 28 was introduced in April of 2011, where you could only have 15% exposure to offshore investments. And contrary to the noise in the market, you always hear clamping down on offshore exposure in retirement funds. The trend is actually the opposite. So now you can have up to 45% offshore exposure in your retirement fund. So what would this look like if we take a look at a typical balanced fund in your retirement funds? You would have some SA equities, some global equities, some global property, and global bonds. So you can see that in a balanced fund like this, you would have up to 45% exposure through equities and property. So the next investment I'm going to speak about is quite badly advertised, and we often see clients inappropriately invested in a tax-free investment. So a tax-free investment would also gain indirect offshore exposure. However, there's no limitations on how much offshore exposure you can have, depending on the service provider. But these contributions aren't tax deductible, but any growth and interest earned within the tax-free investment is tax-free. So these investments are best to put next to your retirement funding to use in retirement, as you can only contribute up to $500,000 over your lifetime. So there's a point where you wouldn't be able to contribute to this investment anymore, and let it grow over the years that you're still working and draw from it tax-free in your retirement. So it has retirement planning advantages, and it shouldn't be used to access money in the short term and take money in and out, because that loses the contributions that you put in. So the next investment is a living annuity. So in living annuities, you can also have up to 100% offshore exposure. There is accessibility limitations on getting the money out, so you can only draw between 2.5% and 17.5% of the fund value per year. So it's important to just speak with your financial advisor and make sure that you're on the same page when it comes to what you require in your retirement, so that we can use a living annuity and discretionary funds appropriately. Again, living annuities don't form part of your estate, so no estate duty and executor's fees, so it can be an effective estate planning tool. And while you might think, okay, if I'm in a living annuity now and I immigrate, what do? I can't disinvest these funds and take them with me. You can invest the living annuity 100% with global exposure. So hedging a bit against the rand, while the money will still pay out to your SA bank accounts, at least the underlying funds are invested in an offshore currency or hedged against the rand. So in a living annuity, if you pass away, your beneficiaries can take a cash portion, which is taxed in the deceased name, or they can take it as a living annuity and keep it in that structure, and they can draw down the minimum amount from that investment and maybe reinvest that amount in their retirement fund to offset the tax payable while they're still earning an income. So the next two investments I'm going to touch on are investments where you can invest directly offshore. So you can have an offshore unit trust, an offshore endowment, or you can have cash offshore. You do need a tax clearance when it comes to getting these funds offshore, so getting them from rands into hard currency, as Erin mentioned. But the minimums to these investments have reduced substantially over time. So it doesn't mean that you need to have $20,000 to be able to get into these investments. It's as low as $3,500 now to open these kinds of investments. The income is taxed within the investment, and when you make withdrawals, you're also subject to capital gains tax when selling units. So also important to plan there. Just because it's offshore doesn't mean that you're not going to pay any taxes in South Africa. And then depending on the service provider, you might need a foreign will for your offshore unit trust. So I'm just going to touch on endowments. Also, you can have an offshore endowment. You can open an offshore endowment from as low as $3,500. These types of investment vehicles are taxed within the fund. So there's no, I don't want to say no tax on interest, but when you withdraw from these types of investments, it's taxed at a flat rate, so income at 30% and the capital gain at 12%. So you can also appoint a beneficiary on these kinds of funds, and the proceeds of the fund will pay directly to that beneficiary in the event of your death. So an endowment doesn't then attract executor's fees, but it would still form part of your estate for estate duty. So as Erin mentioned, we do ask a lot of questions, and it's for us to better understand you and give advice. But the reason behind that is because it can be a little bit complicated, and we don't want to use an investment vehicle that isn't appropriate for your needs and your tax needs.
I just wanted to briefly touch on what we're calling offshore cash. So if you have externalized your cash and it's sitting in a bank account, there seems to be a misconception that, okay, once we've externalized it and it now sits in a US dollar bank account, it's almost seen as an investment. That misconception is there because your funds are not going to continue to grow just because you now have externalized them into a different currency. Typically, we have seen interest rates globally have been quite low in comparison to South Africa. So just understand that even if you hold cash offshore, you need to think about it as you would if you had cash in South Africa. So if it needs to be invested, if you have large amounts lying in offshore bank accounts, it's not going to grow in that bank account. Does it need to be invested appropriately? What are you wanting to do with that investment? And also to understand that there are tax implications to having it. So as a South African resident, you need to declare your worldwide assets. and foreign interest would form part of that. And then the other thing to consider is what happens if you pass away. So how is that going to be dealt with? Do you need to have an offshore will to deal with it? Do you need to have an agent appointed, almost like an executor? And as well as inheritance tax. So depending on the country that is domiciled in, will inheritance tax come into play? So having an offshore bank account, I think it's important to understand what is this money going to do, why is it there, and do we need to look at it and how it's going to be dealt with, not just here and now, but once you pass away as well. So I think we've covered quite a bit, and we don't want to make it sound overly complicated. As your financial planner, we do consider all of these factors when advising you on the most appropriate product. So to just cover them briefly again, I think your tax planning is absolutely key. So understanding, are you a tax resident now? Are you likely going to continue to be a tax resident? Where are you going to be taxed? So are you going to be taxed on your worldwide assets or just your South African assets? And your tax reporting, are you required to report the taxes? So depending on the structure you're in, so as an example, if you go into a unit trust structure, you are still required to report on the interest and the capital gains, whereas an endowment structure will take that reporting obligation and put it onto the company. From a liquidity perspective, I think that's quite a self-explanatory one, but just to really understand when you need to access these funds, are you able to access them easily, and where do you need to access them? So again, if you're living in South Africa and you are wanting to withdraw your funds, if they are held directly offshore, some of these companies have long turnaround times in order to withdraw these funds, or now you need to start thinking about currency, what's happening with the currency, when do I exchange? So maybe an indirect investment would be a more appropriate solution for you if you are living in South Africa. And I think a very, very big part is estate planning, which will probably take a whole nother workshop. But it's so important to understand what happens to these investments when you pass away. How do they get distributed to your loved ones in a way that's easy and cost effective?